In the summer of 2023, a small team from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland opened a series of enclosures deep inside the Cairngorms National Park and watched 19 of the rarest mammals in Britain step into wild Highland air for the first time in their lives. Each cat wore a GPS collar. Each had been bred in captivity for this exact moment. 5 years earlier, the species they belonged to had been declared functionally extinct in Britain, not endangered. Not critically threatened. Extinct, a word scientists use when they believe a wild population can no longer sustain itself. 11 months later, in late May 2024, the project's trail cameras captured something the team admitted they had not dared to dream about. Footage so significant that the project's conservation manager described it as the most exciting moment of the entire program. What those cameras recorded did not just change the trajectory of one of the most desperate conservation efforts in European history. It forced a direct confrontation with one of the most consequential questions in modern rewilding. If we can pull a species back from functional extinction in under 12 months, what exactly does extinct mean, and what are we prepared to bring back next? Every claim in this video is sourced from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, NatureScot, the Cairngorms National Park Authority, and the Saving Wildcats Partnership's published monitoring data. This is not speculation. This is what GPS collars tracking 600 square kilometers of Highland territory, 154 genetic samples analyzed by the RZSS Wild Genes Laboratory, and time-stamped trail camera footage actually documented. The evidence is institutional, peer-reviewed, and public. The conclusions it forces are not. The mainstream scientific consensus, as of 2018, held that the Scottish wildcat's wild genetic line had been permanently dissolved. Not by hunting, not by habitat loss alone, but by hybridization with domestic and feral cats so extensive that the pure wild phenotype had effectively ceased to exist in the open landscape. Of 154 wild samples collected and analyzed for genetic purity, not a single animal met the 75% threshold required to be classified as a true Scottish wildcat. Not one. The species in the wild was gone. What the Saving Wildcats project did next, and what those trail cameras proved 11 months after the first release, is the story this video is built on. To understand why what those trail cameras captured in May 2024 mattered so much, you need to understand what was almost lost, and how completely. The Scottish wildcat, Felis sylvestris grampia, is not a stray. It is not a feral tabby that wandered into the hills. It is Europe's only surviving native wild felid in the British Isles, a separate evolutionary lineage with a presence in Britain stretching back thousands of years before the first domestic cat ever arrived on these shores. An adult male can weigh up to 8 kilograms. Broader in the skull, heavier in the limb, and fundamentally different in temperament from anything you have ever kept in a house. Its tail is thick, blunt, and ringed in bold dark bands that end in a solid black tip. No domestic cat has that tail, not one. It is a stalking ambush predator built for the wet, dense, shadowed understory of native Highland woodland, and for centuries, it shaped everything that lived beneath that canopy. Once, this animal ranged across the entire British mainland. England, Wales, the Borders, the Lowlands, the Highland tiger held the whole island. The collapse came in 3 waves, and each one was worse than the last. The first wave was deliberate. Gamekeepers in the 18th and 19th centuries treated the wildcat as vermin, a competitor for game birds on the estates of the landed gentry. They trapped it, shot it, and poisoned it with a systematic efficiency that reduced the entire British population to a single refuge, the remote Scottish Highlands north of the Great Glen. The second wave was quieter. As the 20th century consumed Highland woodland for agriculture and commercial forestry, the wildcat lost the structural habitat it required, the ancient, complex, multi-layered native forest that had sustained its prey base and its solitude for millennia. Fragmented populations became isolated populations. Isolated populations became small populations. Small populations became vulnerable to something the gamekeepers had never considered. The third wave was the one that finished it, and it did not come from a gun. As wildcat numbers fell, the barrier between the species and its domestic relative, feral and free-roaming cats, present across rural Scotland in their thousands, collapsed. Wildcats began hybridizing, not by choice, by arithmetic. When a population shrinks below a critical threshold, mate selection becomes a function of proximity, not purity. By the time geneticists from the RZSS Wild Genes Laboratory began systematically sampling wild animals in the early 2010s, they were already finding evidence of irreversible genetic erosion. When they completed their analysis of 154 wild samples, animals trapped, swabbed, and released across the entire remaining Highland range, the number of individuals who met the 75% genetic purity threshold required to be classified as a true Scottish wildcat was 0. Not a handful, not a marginal case or two. 0. Think about that. The most comprehensive genetic survey ever conducted of this species in the wild found that the wild line, the original line, the line that had survived in Britain since before recorded human history, was gone from the open landscape. If you want to see how we continue challenging official narratives with hard evidence and refusing to look away from the stories that actually matter, hit subscribe. We document what is real. Now, back to the project, because what Scotland did next would take 5 years of captive breeding, millions of pounds, and a scientific gamble that almost no one believed would work in time. Here is what the science demanded in response to that 0. The wild line was gone. The only genetically pure Scottish wildcats left alive on Earth were the ones already in human custody, held in a small network of specialist breeding facilities, including the Closed Access Centre at the Highland Wildlife Park near Kingassy. The Saving Wildcats Partnership, coordinated by the RZSS, made a decision that was either visionary or desperate depending on your perspective. They would rebuild the wild population entirely from captivity, not supplement it, not support it, rebuild it from nothing in the open landscape, using animals that had never once navigated a Highland winter, located prey under snow, or evaded a predator without a fence between them. The breeding program ran for 5 years. By 2022, the centre had produced 22 kittens, each one genetically screened, health assessed, and behaviourally evaluated for release suitability. The team developed what they called a soft release strategy. Rather than opening a crate and stepping back, each cat was placed into an acclimatization enclosure within the Cairngorms, a contained space inside the release territory where it could adjust to Highland weather, Highland scent, and Highland silence before the enclosure door was opened. The logic was sound. The preparation was meticulous. The risks, according to the project's own documentation, were significant. But the biggest threats the cats would face in the open landscape were not the ones the team had spent years preparing for. And the GPS data from the first winter would make that disturbingly clear. Here is where the data stopped being worrying and started being extraordinary. Through the autumn and winter of 2023, the GPS collars told a story the team had dared to hope for but could not assume. The released cats were moving, not randomly, purposefully, covering terrain that stretched across Badenoch and Strathspey, navigating river systems and forest corridors, establishing home ranges in Highland ground they had never touched before their release day. Animals that had spent their entire lives inside an enclosure were within weeks behaving as the ecological record said their ancestors had always behaved. And then, in the data from the winter breeding season, something shifted. The GPS signals of certain individuals began to overlap, briefly, repeatedly, in patterns that field ecologists recognized immediately. The cats were finding each other, unassisted. In the dark, in the cold, across hundreds of square kilometers of Highland terrain, they were pairing. The team placed trail cameras at the locations the GPS data flagged as significant. And in late May 2024, 11 months after the enclosure doors first opened, one of those cameras triggered. What it recorded were kittens, 4 weeks old, born in the wild. The first documented wild-born Scottish wildcats in generations, not in a breeding facility, not behind mesh, but in the undergrowth of the Cairngorms National Park, in a den chosen by a mother who had made every decision herself. Dr. Kerry Langridge, conservation manager for the Saving Wildcats project, described the footage as the most exciting moment of the entire program. David Field, chief executive of the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, called it a historic step for the species. When the people who spent 5 years and millions of pounds building this project use words like historic and did not dare to dream, that is not press release language. That is the measured vocabulary of scientists who have just watched something they were not certain was possible become real. Let that land for a second. A species declared functionally extinct in 2018. 6 years later, kittens in the wild, on camera. If this evidence is reshaping what you thought you knew about extinction, hit the like button and drop your thoughts on the Highland tiger in the comments. The scientific community is still processing what this project proved. Now, back to the story, because the wild-born kittens were only the first of 3 discoveries, and the second one changes the scale of everything. By 2025, the Saving Wildcats project had 46 genetically pure Scottish wildcats living in the open landscape of the Cairngorms. Not 19, 46, a number that represents not just survival, but multiplication, a self-sustaining process that the project's own scientists had not dared to forecast for the first breeding season. The second discovery was surviving adults, tracked through a second Highland winter, holding territory. The third was evidence of a second breeding cohort, the wild-born kittens of 2024, growing up in a landscape their ancestors had shaped for thousands of years, with no memory of an enclosure. Step back from the individual details for a moment and look at the shape of what this project proved. 154 samples, 0 pure wildcats, a species declared extinct in the wild, a 5-year captive breeding program, 19 animals released into open terrain, GPS signals crossing 600 square kilometers of highland forest, a winter pairing, a den, a camera trigger, 4-week-old kittens, 46 animals by 2025. That is not a conservation story, that is a proof of concept. And here is what that proof of concept means, stated plainly, without qualification. If a functionally extinct species can establish a self-sustaining wild breeding population in under 12 months, then functional extinction is not a biological endpoint. It is a resource allocation decision. Every species we have declared lost was declared lost at a specific moment by specific institutions working within specific budgets. The Highland tiger did not come back because the science changed. It came back because someone decided to fund the attempt. The question is no longer whether captive-bred animals can rewild successfully. The Cairngorms answered that. The question is which species we choose to apply that answer to, and which ones we decide, through inaction, do not deserve the attempt. Because the Saving Wildcats project has already generated a pressure that its own architects acknowledge openly. If a 6-kilogram cat can reclaim a forest, what is the scientific argument against returning the animal that once stood at the top of that same ecosystem? The grey wolf has been absent from Scotland for over 250 years. The ecological case for its return is documented, debated, and politically radioactive. The Wildcat project did not create that debate. But it removed one of its last remaining scientific objections. If you found something in this story that changed how you understand what extinction actually means, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to see it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. The Highland tiger is back in the Cairngorms. The enclosures are empty, and somewhere in the undergrowth of a Scottish forest, a wild-born cat that has never seen a cage is hunting in the dark, the first link in a chain that was supposed to have ended forever.